The high New Mexico plains were cracked white with drought, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. For 2 years, the heat had baked the land and everything on it, including the small homestead of Clara Winthrop. Her world had shrunk to the size of this dust-blurred patch of earth, the sagging porch, the empty barn, and the dry well. It had been 2 years since the collapse at the Silver Queen mine had taken her husband, Silas, and 5 other men. 2 years since the town of San Miguel, a mile down the road, had offered its brief, awkward pity and then retreated, leaving her to the silence and the heat. Clara had been 19 when she married, 21 when she was widowed. Now, at 23, she felt as brittle and old as the fence posts bordering her failed cornfield. Life was a routine of small, necessary tasks. She woke before the sun, not to beat the heat, that was impossible, but to meet it on her own terms. She mended Silas's old shirts until they were more thread than cotton, boiled beans, and tended a small, stubborn patch of herbs by the kitchen door, watering them with the dregs from her washing basin. Her isolation was a living thing. It sat with her at the small kitchen table and lay beside her in the empty bed. The townspeople saw her as a ghost, a reminder of bad luck. She was the woman whose husband had been crushed by half a mountain. They stayed away, and she was, in a strange, hollow way, grateful. She had forgotten how to make small talk, how to smile when she did not mean it. The dust was more honest company. This morning, like every morning, she carried the heavy wooden bucket toward the well. The pulley shrieked a dry, metal complaint as she lowered the bucket, the sound unnerving in the vast silence. She pulled it up, hand over hand, her palms raw. It was only half full. The well was failing. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, tightened her stomach. If the well went dry, she would be finished. She would have to sell the land for pennies, sell the mule, and go to San Miguel to beg for work as a laundress or something worse. She sloshed the precious water into her carrying bucket and turned back toward the house. That was when she saw it. A shape lay near the low stone wall of the well, a dark heap that did not belong. It was not a tumbleweed, not a dead coyote. Her first thought was a drunk from town, passed out on her land. Anger flickered. She did not have the strength to deal with another person's carelessness. She set the bucket down and walked closer, her steps hesitant. It was a man. He was lying face down, his clothes torn, his body unnaturally still. "Mister?" she called out, her voice thin. No reply. She stepped closer, her hand rising to her throat. He was an Indian. The long, black hair was matted with dirt and something dark and sticky. He wore hide leggings, torn and blood-soaked, and a ripped calico shirt that was clearly not his own. He was wounded, badly. She circled him, like a coyote approaching a trap. Flies buzzed thick around his head, and a dark stain spreading across his side. His face was turned away, pressed into the alkali dust, but she could see his hands. They were behind his back, bound at the wrists with a rawhide strip. Someone had done this, shot him, beaten him, and left him here to die. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the one thing she feared more than the drought. The newspapers from Santa Fe were full of it. Raids, savages, murder. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed, angry tones. The Comanche were ghosts, striking and vanishing, and the hatred for them was as thick and hot as the air itself. Her instinct was to run. Run to the house, bolt the door, and wait, or run to town, fetch Sheriff Brody. He was a hard man, but he was the law. He would know what to do. He would come here, see the body, and take it away. But the man was not a body. Not yet. A small, shuddering groan escaped him. He was alive. Clara froze. Helping him was impossible. It was madness. If the posse that was always out riding found him here, on her land, tended by her, they would not ask questions. They would burn her barn, maybe her house. They would call her a traitor, a squaw lover. They might even hang her from her own cottonwood tree. She should leave him. It was the only sane thing to do. He was as good as dead anyway. She took a step back, but her eyes fell on his bound hands. The rawhide had cut deep into his skin, which was raw and bleeding from his struggles. He had been left trussed up, helpless. It was the helplessness that held her. She knelt, her knees cracking in the dirt, her mind screaming at her to stand up and run. She needed to see his face, gently, afraid of what she would find. She put her hand on his shoulder to turn him. He was heavy, a dead weight, but she managed to roll him slightly onto his back. His face was a ruin. One eye was swollen completely shut, his lip split open, his cheekbone bruised a dark purple. He was young, younger than she had thought, perhaps her own age, and she knew him. The breath left her body in a painful rush. It couldn't be. She looked from the dust to his face, and the world tilted. The white-hot sun vanished, and for a moment, she was not in the drought. She was freezing, the world gone white, the air so cold it burned her lungs. 4 years ago? No, almost 5. She and Silas had been traveling to Santa Fe, chasing another of his rumors of a strike. He'd ignored the warnings of the old trapper in the last town. He'd pushed on, determined. The blizzard had come out of the north like a white wall, hitting them on an open plain. Their horses, panicked and blind, had scattered. Silas, his face already gray with frostbite, had fallen. She had tried to drag him, but her own legs were numb, her hands useless claws. They were going to die. She had known it. She had sat down in the snow, curled over her knees, and waited. Then he had appeared. He had come out of the swirling white like a spirit, on a shaggy pony. He was wrapped in a great buffalo hide. He had looked at Silas, struggling to reload his pistol with frozen fingers. And then he had looked at her. He had dismounted, said nothing. He walked straight to her, lifted her as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour, and put her on his horse. He pulled Silas up behind her. He had led them, walking, for what felt like hours, until they reached a shallow cleft in some rocks, barely a cave. He had built a tiny, smokeless fire, and when he saw her shivering, her body seizing in violent spasms, he had taken off the great buffalo hide, his only protection, and wrapped it around her. He had sat with his back to the wind, a living shield, watching the storm, while Silas muttered feverish, angry things by the small fire. At dawn, the storm had broken. When Clara woke, stiff and aching but alive, he was gone. The heavy buffalo fur was still wrapped tightly around her. She looked at the man dying at her well, the same high cheekbones, though now bruised, the same strong line of a jaw, though now split, the same mouth that had offered no words, only life. It was him. "Oh, God," she whispered. The fear did not leave. It was still there, cold and sharp. But something else rose up to meet it. Gratitude, a debt that had sat in her heart for 5 years, unspoken. He had saved her life. She could not let him die. Not here, not like this. "All right," she said, her voice shaking. "All right, we have to move." He was a big man, and she was small, weakened by poor food and grief. Getting him to the barn was the hardest thing she had ever done. She looped her arms under his, dragging him backward. He groaned, a deep, animal sound of pure agony, and his body went rigid. "I'm sorry," she panted. "I'm sorry, I have to—" She pulled. The dust rose in clouds around them. Her back screamed. Every few feet, she had to stop, her lungs burning. He was a dead weight, slipping from her grasp. She wanted to weep with frustration and terror. What if someone rode by? What if Sheriff Brody circled back? She got him to the barn door. The air inside was hot and still, smelling of old hay and mule. She dragged him into an empty stall at the back, the one hidden by stacks of rotted tack and old barrels. She piled hay around him, then pulled a large, dusty canvas tarp over his body. It was a poor hiding place, but it was all she had. She ran back to the well, her heart pounding. She grabbed a rag and frantically scrubbed the trail of blood and disturbed dust, trying to smooth it over, to make it look like nothing. She kicked dirt over the dark patches. It was a panicked, clumsy effort. She fetched her water bucket and stumbled back to the house, locking the door behind her. For an hour, she sat at her kitchen table, her hands shaking so badly she could not lift her coffee cup. He was in her barn, a wounded Comanche, a man who had saved her, a man who would get her killed. She kept seeing the blizzard, the whiteout, the terror. She remembered the way he had looked at her. Not with malice, not with pity, just a calm assessment. He saw she was dying, and he had stopped it. He had wrapped her in that fur, and she remembered the smell of it. Smoke, sage, and the warm, clean scent of the animal. He had given her his only warmth and asked for nothing. Silas had been furious, ashamed that an Indian had saved his wife when he could not. Silas had called him a buck and savage the whole rest of the trip. But Clara had folded that buffalo hide and kept it, hidden in her trunk, long after Silas had forbidden it. Now, the man who owned it was in her barn. She had to go back. She gathered what she needed: a basin of precious, clean water, lye soap, rags, Silas's old razor, a bottle of whiskey, her sewing needle and some good thread. She had stitched up the mule once when it caught itself on barbed wire. This could not be much different. When she slipped back into the barn, the heat was stifling. She pulled back the canvas. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and rough. "All right," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "Let's see to this." Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady. First, his hands. She used the razor to cut the rawhide strips. They were soaked in blood and stuck to his flesh. He flinched and moaned as she peeled them away, revealing the raw, chafed wounds beneath. She cleaned them gently, biting her lip. Then, the bullet wound. It was high on his side, near his ribs, a ragged, ugly hole. It was deep. She cleaned it with whiskey. He woke then. His one good eye snapped open, and it was not the calm, assessing gaze she remembered. It was wild, black with pain and confusion. A sound tore from his throat, a guttural snarl. He tried to lunge at her, to get up, but the movement sent a spasm of agony through him. "No, no," Clara said, dropping the rag and holding up her hands. "I am helping you. Be still. You are safe." He stared at her. He saw the basin, the bloody rags, her pale, frightened face. He looked down at his own body, at his untied hands. His gaze flew around the dark barn, taking in the stall, the mule in the next pen, the shafts of light cutting through the slats. He recognized her as a white woman. The shame was instant and profound. It was worse than the pain. To be found like this, helpless, beaten, tended by one of them, was a humiliation he could barely stand. He turned his head away, his jaw tight, breathing hard through his nose. "Water," he rasped. His voice was like stones scraping together. She scrambled to the water bucket by the mule's stall, poured some into a tin cup, and brought it back. She had to lift his head for him to drink. He drank greedily, his good eye fixed on her, wary, trying to place her. He did not recognize her. He was just a trapped animal. "Where?" he managed. "My land, my barn," she said softly. "You are safe, for now. You were at my well. I brought you in." He said nothing, just closed his eye. He was assessing, weighing his chances, weighing her. He did not trust her. Why should he? "You're Toa," she said. His eye flew open again. The wildness was back, mixed with sharp suspicion. How did she know his name? He had never told her. "I heard my husband say it," she lied, fumbling. "Years ago, the blizzard. You saved us." His expression did not change, but the focus in his eyes sharpened. He was looking at her, really looking. He saw the faded calico dress, the thinness of her arms, the grief that clung to her like the dust. "Snow woman," he whispered. A small, tight knot in Clara's chest loosened. He remembered. He said nothing more. He seemed to fall back into the pain, his body rigid. She went back to work, cleaning the bullet wound as best she could. She did not dare to stitch it. She just packed it with a clean rag soaked in whiskey and bound his torso tightly with strips of a torn sheet. She cleaned the blood and dirt from his face, her touch as light as she could make it. He endured it, his eyes closed, his body tense. She gave him a little more water and then covered him again. "Rest," she said. "I will be back." She spent the rest of the day in a fog of terror, jumping at every sound, the creak of the porch swing, the stamping of the mule, the whistle of the wind. Each one was the sound of the posse, of Sheriff Brody. Late in the afternoon, they came. A sharp, heavy knock on her front door made her drop the bowl she was washing. It shattered on the floor. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart trying to escape her chest, and opened the door. Sheriff Brody stood there, his hat in his hands, but his eyes were hard. Beside him was Jedediah Stone, the biggest rancher in the county, and 2 other men she didn't know, all carrying rifles. "Ma'am," Brody said, his voice flat, "just checking on you." "Sheriff, Mr. Stone," she tried to make her voice normal. "It's a hot day for a ride." "It is," Stone said. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust by her porch. "We're out on business. Lost some cattle up by the ridge. Found tracks. Looks like Comanche." Clara gripped the doorframe. "I haven't seen any cattle." "We ain't looking for cattle anymore. Mrs. Winthrop," Brody said, his eyes scanning the yard, moving past her to look into the dark hall of her house. "We found blood. A lot of it. And tracks of a half-dozen shod horses chasing one unshod pony. They had a fight. A savage, wounded and runnin', is a dangerous thing," Stone added, his thumb hooked in his belt. "A woman out here alone. You should be careful. You seen anything? Heard anything at all?" The lie was dry in her throat. "Nothing, Sheriff, nothing but the dust. The wind's been blowing all day." Brody squinted at her. He knew she was lying, or he suspected it. She was too pale, too quick to answer. His gaze drifted past her shoulder, toward the barn. "You check your livestock? Your mule all right?" "He's fine. Everything is fine," she said, her voice a little too high. "We'd like to take a look around. Ma'am, if you don't mind, just to be sure." "In my barn. It's the first place a man looking for shade or water would go," Stone said, stepping forward. "No," Clara said, stepping out onto the porch to block him. The sudden force in her own voice surprised her. "You will not. That is my private property. Mr. Stone, my husband, Silas, he built that barn. You are not going in there." Stone bristled, his face darkening. "Now you listen here. Widow." "That's enough, Jed," Brody said, putting a hand on his arm. He looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. He was weighing her, just as Toa had. He was weighing the trouble of forcing the issue with a widow against his own suspicion. "We'll be on our way, ma'am," Brody said finally. "But you lock your door tonight. You lock it tight, and if you see anything, you send up a smoke signal. You hear me?" "I hear you, Sheriff. Thank you for the concern." She watched them mount their horses. Stone gave the barn one last, long, hateful look before he spurred his horse and rode off. Clara stumbled back inside and collapsed against the door, her legs giving out. She was shaking so violently she could barely breathe. They had been right there. 10 more seconds, and they would have found him. That night, she could not sleep. The house was too quiet, the barn too close. She lit a lantern, took a chair, and went back to the stall. She sat by the hay, the lantern casting a low, golden light. Moths and small insects fluttered against the glass. The barn was hot, suffocating. Toe was sleeping. His breathing was deeper now, more regular. The fever was on him. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, but he was alive. She watched his face in the lamplight. The swelling had gone down a little. She could see the man from the blizzard more clearly now. The strong, straight nose, the firm line of his mouth. She remembered the snow melting in his black hair. It had glistened like tiny jewels in the firelight. He had sat so still, his gaze fixed on the storm outside the cave, as if daring it. Why had he helped them? A white man who clearly hated him, and his trembling wife. He could have ridden by. He could have taken their horses, their supplies. He had asked for nothing. He had given them his only fur, his only protection from the wind. And now, what was he running from? Shot, beaten, and bound. This was not a fair fight. This was an execution that had failed, or an ambush. Who was hunting him? The ranchers, like Stone, or someone else? She looked at the man who had saved her, and a strange, aching kinship filled her chest. The town had left her to die in her own way, in the drought of her grief, and someone had left him to die in the dust by her well. They were two of a kind, perhaps, two people who had run out of luck, abandoned by the world. She dipped a rag in the water bucket and gently touched it to his forehead, wiping away the sweat. He stirred, a low murmur in his throat. But he did not wake. Clara sat back in her chair, the lantern at her feet, and prepared to watch over him through the long, dangerous night. The fever held him for 3 days. 3 days and 3 nights that blurred into one long, terrifying vigil for Clara. She moved between the house and the barn like a ghost, her body running on dried apples and stale coffee, her nerves stretched thin as wire. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, bathed his hot skin with cool rags, and cleaned the angry wound on his side until her own hands were raw. She whispered to him in the dark, meaningless, soothing things. "It's all right. You're safe. Just rest." On the 4th morning, she entered the stall and found him watching her. The fever had broken. His one good eye was clear, lucid, and fixed on her face with a startling intensity. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his dark hair falling over his shoulder. She stopped, the small bowl of cornmeal mush trembling in her hands. "You are awake," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her tired face, the fear in her eyes. "Snow woman," he said. The words were a low rasp, his English thick and halting, but she understood. A relief so sharp it was almost painful washed through her. He did remember. He knew who she was. "I am Clara," she said, kneeling beside the hay. "Clara Winthrop." "Toa," he replied, touching his own chest briefly. He looked down at the clean bandages wrapped around his ribs, then at his freed wrists, which were already beginning to heal. He looked back at her. "Why?" "You know why," she said softly, offering him the bowl. "You saved me." He took the bowl, his hand surprisingly steady. He ate slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off her. He saw more than the woman from the blizzard. He saw the 2 years that had passed. He saw the hollows under her cheekbones, the faint lines of worry etched around her mouth, the deep, settled sadness in her eyes that had not been there before. He saw a woman who was thinner, harder, and infinitely more tired. And she, in the clear light of day, saw him. The trauma was stark in his gaze, a banked fire of pain and anger that his stoic face could not hide. He was a man who had seen too much, and it had been carved into him. Their conversations, over the next few days, were brief and charged. He was a difficult patient, not because he complained, he never made a sound of pain, but because he was proud, and the shame of his helplessness was a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. He hated being tended. He hated the weakness. "The bullet?" he asked one afternoon, his hand flat against the bandage. "It is in." "I don't think so," Clara said, wringing out a cloth. "I think it passed through. It was a clean hole, mostly, just ragged." He grunted, a small sound of acknowledgement. He did not thank her, but when she brought him food, he ate it. When she brought him water, he drank it. It was his own form of truce. The town, however, would not allow a truce. The world outside the barn was pressing in. Clara needed flour and salt. She had put off the trip for as long as she could, but her supplies were gone. She left Toa with a full bucket of water, a heel of bread, and a warning. "Do not make a sound. Do not even breathe. If you can help it, I will be back before noon." She hitched the mule to the small buckboard and rode into San Miguel. The town felt different. The heat was the same, but the air was laced with something else, suspicion. Men were gathered in front of the saloon, talking in low, angry voices. They stopped when they saw her, their eyes following the buckboard as it squeaked down the main street. Inside Henderson's general store. The air was thick with the smell of pickles and kerosene. Mr. Henderson, a small man with a graying mustache, forced a thin smile. Mrs. Winthrop, been a while. I need flour, Mr. Henderson, and salt, she said, keeping her voice steady, avoiding his eyes. Heard you had visitors out your way, he said, scooping flour into a sack. Clara's stomach tightened. Just Sheriff Brody? He was checking on me. Yes. He tied the sack. Jed Stone still riled. He's convinced that blood trail he found leads right back to his missing cattle. Says he's lost 3 more head since. He's offering $50 for any sign of a dirty redskin, as he puts it. Clara flinched at the term. I haven't seen anything, she said, placing her few coins on the counter. You'd best hope you don't, Henderson said, his voice dropping. There's men riding who don't plan to bring anyone back alive. She fled the store, her supplies in her arms, and hurried back to the mule. She felt the eyes of the town on her back every step of the way. The ride home was worse. The open plain, usually a comfort in its emptiness, now felt full of hidden watchers. She was unhitching the mule when her neighbor, Martha Albright, appeared. Martha was a tall, severe woman whose husband had died of cholera 5 years back. She had managed her land with a grim, joyless efficiency that the town admired. Her property bordered Clara's on the west. Clara, she called, her voice sharp as a spade. She stood at the fence line, holding a small jar. She did not smile. Mrs. Albright, Clara said, wiping her sweaty palms on her apron. Brought you some peach preserves, Martha said, holding the jar out. From last year's canning. Looks like we won't get any this year, with the drought. That's very kind, Clara said, walking over to take it. It's not kindness, it's sense. Nothing should go to waste. Martha's eyes, small and dark, scanned Clara's property. They lingered on the house, the failing corn, the barn. It's not right. A woman alone out here. I manage, Clara said stiffly. For now, Martha sniffed. But this land needs a man's hand. And with this talk of Indians, you're a target, girl. A woman alone is an invitation. Clara said nothing, just gripped the jar. You know Mr. Davies from San Miguel, the blacksmith? His wife passed from the fever. He's a good, sturdy man. He's looking, and he's noted your industry. Clara stared at her. Are you trying to marry me off, Martha? I'm trying to save your property, Martha snapped. A widow with a good plot of land is a temptation for a man like Davies. He could work this land, or you could sell. Sell to me. I'd give you a fair price. Better than the bank will when that well of yours goes dry. You could move to town. Be safe. I am not selling, Clara said, her voice cold. Martha's gaze sharpened. It drifted to the barn. You should keep that mule of yours quiet. Heard a strange noise in there late last night. A man's voice. It sounded like... Clara's blood turned to ice. It's the wind, or rats. The barn is old. Rats, Martha repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. Yes, well, you think on what I said. A foolish woman is a dead woman. She turned, her black dress stark against the pale dust, and marched back toward her own house. Clara ran to the barn, her heart hammering with a new, sharper terror. She burst through the door and found the stall empty. For a second, her mind went blank. He was gone. They had found him. Then she saw him. He was on the other side of the barn, by the great door, clinging to a post. He had tried to stand, to walk, and he had made it perhaps 20 feet before his legs gave out. He was on his knees, his forehead pressed against the wood, his body shaking with sweat and exertion. He was trying to leave. What are you doing? She cried, her voice breaking with fear and anger. He looked up, his face a mask of pained fury. I leave, he panted. She knows. The woman. She knows. She knows nothing. She's a gossip. You can't even stand. She will. Tell. They come. He tried to pull himself up again, his knuckles white on the post. I will not be here, not bring this to you." He was ashamed. Ashamed to be protected by her. Ashamed of his weakness. And terrified of what they would do to her when they found him. He would rather die in the desert than be the cause of her ruin. "You'll die before you get a mile," she said, her voice trembling. She grabbed his arm. "Get back to the stall, now." He shook her off, a surprising strength in his arm. "No." He took a breath and shoved himself to his feet. He stood for a moment, swaying, then took one step. His legs buckled. He fell hard against a stack of old barrels, sending them clattering. The sound was deafening in the quiet afternoon. "Be still," Clara hissed, grabbing him, trying to pull him back into the shadows. He turned his face away from her. "Is better," he whispered. His voice choked. "Better I die." That broke her. The tight, careful control she had held for days, for years, snapped. "Better," she said, her voice low and fierce. She stood over him, her small body vibrating with a sudden, wild anger. "Better for who? For you? Maybe. You get to be a martyr. What about me? What do I get?" He looked up, stunned by her tone. "You saved my life," she said, her words tumbling out. "In the snow. You carried me. You wrapped me in your own fur, and you sat in the freezing wind so I could be warm. I have lived with that debt for 5 years. Toe, I have lived with the shame of my husband cursing you for it. Don't you dare take this away from me." She knelt in the dirt in front of him, her face close to his. "You are not going to die, not like this. You saved me once. Let me do the same. Let me pay what I owe. Please." He stared at her. This was not the frightened snow woman. This was someone else, someone as fierce and desperate as he was. He saw that she was not just repaying a debt. She was holding on to something, holding on to him. He was the first living, breathing thing that had needed her in 2 years. He was her purpose. Slowly, his body shaking, he gave a single, pained nod. He would stay. She helped him back to the stall. It took all her strength. He leaned on her heavily, his body hot and solid against her. His breath labored in her ear. She settled him in the hay, her hands lingering on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. He just closed his eyes, his face tight with exhaustion and a conflict she could not name. That night, the heat in the barn became a physical weight. The air was too thick to breathe, charged with the smell of animals, hay, and his healing wound. He was restless, shifting in the hay, his breathing shallow. "I need sky," he said, his voice rough. "Air." She understood. The walls were closing in on him. "Wait," she said. She went to the house, checked the road. Nothing. The world was asleep, the moon just a sliver, the stars thick as spilled salt in the blackness. She came back. "Come on," she said. "Lean on me." Getting him out of the barn was a slow, agonizing process. He was weak, but he was trying. He put his arm over her shoulders, and she wrapped her own around his waist, taking on his weight. He was so warm. His skin, bare where his shirt was torn, burned against her arm. She could feel the hard muscle of his side, the way he breathed. They moved in a slow, shuffling rhythm, a single, 4-legged creature in the dark, across the yard, past the woodpile, and onto the back porch, which was hidden from the road by the bulk of the house. He sank onto the top step with a low groan of relief. Clara sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her heart pounding from the exertion. For a long time, they just sat in the vast, silver-lit silence. The night air was cooler here, and a small breeze whispered through the dry cottonwood. He spoke first, his voice low, his gaze on the distant mountains, which were black shapes against the starry sky. "They hunt me," he said. She waited. She knew this was important. He spoke in fragments, his rough English forcing him to use only the most necessary words. He told her about the peace he had tried to broker. He had spoken to a soldier, a captain, who had promised food for the children if the raid stopped. "He lied," Toa said, his voice flat. "Was a trap. He had gone to the meeting place, as agreed, but the soldiers were not there. Instead, scouts, Comanche scouts, working for the army, were waiting. They were the ones who had raided Jedstone's ranch, wearing the paint of Toa's own band. To break the truce. "They betray," he said, his hand clenching into a fist. "My people. They think I talk to soldiers. Think I sell them. Soldiers. They think I lead raid. Both hunt me." He had been running for a week, caught between the two worlds he had tried to bridge. Clara listened, her heart aching for him. He was an outcast, betrayed by everyone. The trust in his voice, the raw, painful confession, unlocked her own. She found herself speaking, her voice as low as his, telling him things she had never told another soul. "My husband, Silas?" she said, looking down at her hands. He was not the man the town remembers. He was restless. He was always chasing the next thing, a silver strike, a gold rumor. He never saw what he had. He only saw what he didn't. She told him about the mine collapse, the awful, hollow sound of the explosion, the 3 days of digging, of listening at the tunnel mouth, hearing nothing but the shift of rock. "They brought them up in sacks," she whispered. "What was left, I didn't even cry, not at first. I just felt empty, like he had finally found the one hole he couldn't climb out of." She told him about the loneliness, how it was a different kind of cold than the blizzard. The town brought pies for a week. Martha Albright brought a ham. Then they stopped. They look at me, and they see bad luck. They see a failed wife, a barren woman on a dry farm. She took a shuddering breath. "I learned to fix the pump myself. I learned to shoot snakes. I learned to be alone. I thought I had forgotten how to be anything else." They sat in the shared quiet. They were no longer the Snow Woman and the Comanche. They were Clara and Toa, two people marked by loss, living in the margins, cast off by their worlds. A profound, unspoken understanding passed between them, a trust built not on words, but on shared wounds. The days after that night were different. A change had settled over them. He was stronger. He could walk the length of the barn now, his limp pronounced but his strength returning. She still brought him his food, still cleaned and rebandaged his side, but now it was different. When she changed the bandage, her hands were steady, but she was achingly aware of him, aware of the heat of his skin, the texture of it, the hard lines of his body. He was lean, his body a map of old scars, and this new one. She found her hand slowing as she tied the new cloth around his ribs. She was lingering. She told herself it was to make the knot secure. She was lying. He, too, was aware of her. He no longer turned his head away. He watched her, his gaze steady. He watched her small, capable hands. He watched the way a loose strand of her brown hair fell across her cheek. One evening, she brought him his meal. The sun was setting, casting long, dusty shafts of red light through the barn. He was sitting up, his back against the stall wall. She knelt to set the bowl of stew down on the straw beside him. As she did, his hand moved to take the bowl. Her hand, setting it down, brushed his. It was an accident, but it was not. Their fingers touched, skin against skin. A current passed between them, hot and sharp as a spark from a flint. It was a jolt, real and sudden, that made her gasp. She froze. He froze. Their fingers stayed touching, tangled together, for a single, breathless second. Slowly, Clara lifted her eyes to his. His gaze was on her, intense, dark, stripped of all pretense. He was not looking at Snow Woman or his nurse. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw it, a raw, unguarded hunger that mirrored her own. He saw her, not as a widow, not as a ghost, but as a woman. It was too much. It was too fast, too dangerous, too everything. Clara snatched her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. Her face flooded with heat. She looked down, her hair falling forward, a curtain to hide behind. She could not breathe. Toa's jaw tightened. He clenched the hand she had touched into a fist and turned his head, staring at the far wall of the barn. He was ashamed. He was afraid. The silence in the barn was deafening, thick with what had just passed between them, what had almost been acknowledged. Clara scrambled to her feet. "I'll bring water," she stammered. She turned and fled the barn, her heart pounding a wild, panicked rhythm against her ribs. He did not watch her go. He just listened to the sound of her running footsteps fade. Then he closed his eyes, his whole body tense, fighting a new war, one that was raging entirely inside himself. The silence that followed their charged moment in the barn lasted for a full day. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thicker than the dust. Clara brought him food and water, set them down in the hay, and left without a word, her face averted. He, in turn, remained in the shadows of the stall, his face turned to the wall. He was healing. His limp was less pronounced, his movements more sure, but the space between them had become a canyon, a place of shared shame and unspoken fear. The outside world shattered the quiet on the second morning. It was not the slow squeak of a wagon or the plod of a single horse. It was the frantic, desperate drumming of hoofbeats, coming hard from the direction of town. Clara, who had been tossing feed to her mule, ran to the fence line. It was a ranch hand from the Stone property. He was bent low over his horse's neck, not even looking at her, just a man carrying a fire. As he thundered past her property line, he yelled, his voice raw with panic and rage, to an empty road. "He's dead! Billy! They killed him! Stone's boy is dead! An arrow in his back!" The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her hand flew to her mouth, and the small tin bucket of oats slipped from her other hand, spilling onto the dust. Billy Stone, Jedediah's son, a boy of 17, full of brag and foolishness, but just a boy. An arrow. Clara turned and ran. She burst into the barn, her chest heaving. "Toa!" He was already on his feet, his body tense, having heard the shout and the frantic speed of the horse. "A boy is dead!" she panted, leaning against the stall. "Jed Stone's son! He was killed! With an arrow!" Toe's face, which had been regaining its color, went pale beneath the bruises. He did not need to ask what came next. He had lived this his entire life. "They will come," he said, his voice a low, flat statement of fact. "Yes," she whispered, her mind racing. "And they won't search this time. They won't ask questions. They will burn this barn. Toe, with you in it." He looked around, his eyes like a trapped hawk's, searching for an escape he knew did not exist. "The cellar," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "My root cellar? It's under the kitchen floor. It's the only place." He hesitated. The thought of hiding in a hole in the ground, a grave, was abhorrent to him. "Please," she begged, pulling him toward the door. "There is no time. He was riding to town. He's raising the posse. They will be here." The urgency in her voice, the sheer, animal terror, broke through his pride. He nodded. They ran across the yard, Clara scanning the horizon, Toe moving with a pained, jarring limp. She shoved him into the house, bolted the door, and dragged the heavy bearskin rug from the center of the kitchen floor. Beneath it was a thick plank trapdoor with a cold iron ring. She yanked it open. A puff of cool, damp air rose, smelling of packed earth, old potatoes, and mold. "In there," she pointed. He looked into the black square. It was a grave, a trap. "It's small," she said, her voice shaking. "But there are empty barrels in the far corner. Get behind them. Pull the old canvas tarp over you. It's the darkest place." He looked at her, his face a mask of profound, deep shame. "Clara, there is no time for words. Go!" He lowered himself down the short, rickety ladder. She handed him a jug of water. "Do not make a sound," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I don't care what you hear. Do not make a sound. Do not move. Do not breathe." He looked up at her from the darkness, his eyes bleak. Then he vanished behind the barrels. She closed the heavy door, her hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries to settle it into the frame. She dragged the rug back, smoothing it with her foot. She grabbed a broom and swept the floor, her movements jerky and panicked. She sat at the table. She poured a cup of coffee she had made hours ago. It was cold. She held it in. "I heard about your son. I am so sorry. Don't you speak his name, Stone snarled, taking a step toward her. Don't you dare. He pointed a trembling finger at her. He was here. You hit him. He jabbed a thumb toward Martha. She saw you. She heard him. I told them. Clara, Martha said, her voice high and righteous. I told them I heard a man's voice. You lied to me. You harbored a killer. Mrs. Winthrop, Brody said, his voice heavy. He had his hand on his pistol. This is over. A boy is dead. We're past talking. You tell us where that Comanche is, or we will tear this place apart, board by board. I am hiding no one, Clara cried, her voice high and thin. She was a terrible liar, and she knew it. The terror was vibrating in her. I don't know what you're talking about. Search the house. Stone roared. The men exploded into action. They were not searching. They were destroying. They overturned her small table, ripped the quilt from her bed, slashed the mattress. They smashed the few plates she owned, swept the contents of her pantry onto the floor. Clara was pressed against the wall, her hands over her mouth, her eyes screwed shut, trying not to look at the rug. One of the men, a ranch hand she didn't know, kicked the rug. What's this, Sheriff? Clara's heart stopped. She could not breathe. It's the root cellar, you fool, Brody said. He shoved the man aside and pulled the rug back himself. He looked at Clara, his eyes cold. Open it. She just stared at him, shaking her head. Mute! Open it! Stone shouted, his face inches from hers. Brody pushed her out of the way and yanked the trapdoor open. He unhooked the lantern from the wall and held it down into the blackness. The light scanned the small, damp space. It lit the packed earth, the rotting shelves, a few shriveled carrots, and the barrels in the back. Nothing but dirt and spiders, one of the men said. Brody was not convinced. He handed the lantern to the man and lowered himself down the ladder. Clara heard his heavy boots on the cellar floor. She heard him kick something. A barrel. A dull thud. Clara bit her lip so hard she tasted the warm, salt tang of blood. Don't move! Toa! Don't move! Don't breathe! There was another kick, and the sound of an old barrel scraping against the wall. A dead silence. Then Brody's heavy sigh. He climbed back up the ladder, his face grim. He ain't down there. It's empty. Clara's legs gave out. She slid down the wall, gasping for air, relief and terror making her dizzy. He was here, Jed Stone insisted, his voice cracking. He grabbed Clara by the front of her dress, hauling her to her feet. He was. Where did he go? You! I don't know, she screamed, the tears finally coming, hot and real. I don't know anything. Please, just get out. Get out of my house. Jed, let her go, Brody said, pulling Stone's hand away. She's right about one thing. He ain't in the house. Let's check the barn. Burn it, Stone said, his voice flat. Clara froze. What? He's in the hay, or under the floor. Burn it. It'll smoke him out. No! Clara scrambled to her feet, running after them as they stalked out the door. No, please, my mule, my tools. That is everything I have left. Please! Should have thought of that, one of the men sneered. Before you took a savage to your bed. They reached the barn. Stone was already pulling a torch from a saddlebag. Hold on, Jed, Brody said, stopping him. We're men, not animals. We search it first, then we burn it. Get that mule out of there. One of the men untied her mule and let it out, slapping its rump to send it running. The rest, a dozen of them, tore the barn apart. They pitched hay with furious energy, jabbed their rifles into the stacks, overturned the empty water trough, kicked open every stall. Clara stood by the door, weeping, watching the destruction of her small, fragile world. Then, a shout. Sheriff, over here! One of the men was holding something up. It was a handful of the rags she had used to clean Toa's wounds, rags she had hidden badly, stuffed under a loose floorboard. They were stiff and dark with dried blood. Jed Stone walked over and looked at the rags. He looked at Clara. His eyes were not dead anymore. They were burning. He was here, Stone whispered, the words full of a terrible, slow promise. He was here, and she tended him. She kept him safe while he was planning to kill my boy. He's gone now. Jed, Brody said, his voice tired. Look at this mud. He rode out. We're wasting time. He's heading for the mountains. Let's ride. When I find him, Stone said to Clara, his voice shaking, I'm going to bring you a piece of him. He turned. The posse mounted their horses. They thundered out of her yard, a cloud of angry men, their rifles ready, heading north toward the mountains. Martha Albright, who had watched the entire search from the porch, gave Clara one last look, a look of such profound disgust and condemnation that it was worse than Stone's threat. She turned, gathered her skirts, and marched back to her own property. Clara was left alone, standing in the ruined doorway of her ravaged barn, shaking in the sudden, terrible silence. She waited. She did not know how long. She just stood there until the sun began to dip low, painting the sky a sick, bloody red. She had to be sure. She had to be completely, absolutely sure. Finally, she went back to the kitchen. The floor was covered in flour, beans, and broken glass. She walked through the mess and lifted the trap door. They're gone, she called into the darkness. They're gone. He emerged slowly, piece by piece, first his head, then his shoulders. He was covered in dust and cobwebs. In his hand, he gripped the small paring knife she used for potatoes. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ruin of her kitchen. The boy, he said. His voice was a low growl. Yes, she whispered, her throat raw from screaming. They think it was me. Yes, I heard, he said, climbing the last step. He looked at the place where Stone had grabbed her, where her dress was torn at the collar. I heard what he called you. The shame was burning off him, a visible heat. It was not the shame of being weak. It was the shame of being the cause. I go, he said. He started walking, limping heavily, toward the front door. No! Clara ran and stood in front of him, blocking his path. Toe, stop! They will kill you! They are hunting you! He stopped, looking down at her. The anger in his eyes was not wild. It was a cold, hard, settled thing. It frightened her more than Stone's rage. They will kill me. Yes, he said. His English was suddenly sharper. The words clipped. Or I will kill them. But I will not hide. Not in a hole. Not like a snake. His gaze flickered to her torn dress. Not while they touch you, call you. That, for me. So you'll go get yourself killed? She cried, her voice breaking. She grabbed the front of his shirt. That's your answer. You want to be a sacrifice. For my honor? My honor is mine. Toa, it is not something you protect by dying and leaving me to face them alone. He grabbed her wrists and pulled her hands off him, his grip like iron. You do not understand. This is not your fight. You made it my fight, she shouted back, tears of anger and frustration stinging her eyes. You made it my fight when you stayed. You made it my fight when you let me clean your wounds. You made it my fight when you looked at me. The words hung in the ruined kitchen, raw and undeniable. The fury in his face wavered, replaced by that same deep conflict. He was being torn in two. I cannot, he said, his voice choked. I cannot be the man who hides under a floor, while a woman, a good woman, is shamed for him. It is not our way. It is not honor. And our way is to let a lynch mob win? She fired back. That is not my way. That is just dying. He looked past her, at the open door, at the red-streaked sky. He was still going to go. Wait, she said, her voice softening, pleading. Just wait. Until dark. That's all I ask. The posse, they're riding north, to the mountains. They went the wrong way. Just wait. He did not answer. He just stood, rigid. A man caught in an impossible trap. Night fell. The heat did not break. The sky, which had been red, turned a deep, bruised, greenish purple. The air pressure dropped, and the world went unnaturally still. A storm was coming. Clara could not stay in the house. The sight of the destruction made her sick. She went to the barn to check on the mule, which had returned, spooked and hungry. She was forking hay into its stall when Toa appeared in the doorway. He could not stay in the house either. It was her grave, not his. They stood in the center of the barn, the silence stretching between them, thicker than the coming storm. The wind began to pick up, a low, rising whistle through the slats in the wood. It made the lantern flame, which she had hung on a post, dance wildly. The tension was a living thing. It was the shame, the shared danger, the unspoken accusation, and the memory of their fingers brushing in the straw. "You should have left me at the well," he said at last, his back to her. "No," she said, setting the pitchfork down. "This," he swept his hand out, indicating the wrecked stall, the house beyond. "Your name, your safety. It is my fault." "It is their fault," she said, her voice hard. "It is Jed Stone's fault, and Martha Albright's, and the men who shot you and left you to die." He turned to face her. A low, distant rumble of thunder. "Why?" he asked. His voice was quiet, raw. "Not the debt, not the blizzard. Why, me?" She walked closer to him, stopping a few feet away. The barn felt charged, the air electric. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the truth. "In the snow," he said, his voice a low rumble, matching the storm. His gaze was distant, seeing the past. "You were so afraid, but you did not cry. Your husband, he cursed the sky, he fought the snow, but you were just fading." Clara stopped breathing. She remembered that, the feeling of giving up, of just letting the cold take her. "I thought you would die," he said. He looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a deep, ancient pain. "I remember your breath." He lifted his hand, his fingers slightly parted, as if holding something small and fragile. It shook like wind, like a small bird's wing. It was a small thing, but it was still fighting. He lowered his hand. "I could not let it stop." The confession settled over her. He had not saved her as an abstract. He had saved her because he had seen her, truly seen her, in the moment of her deepest despair. The air in the barn crackled. The first fat drops of rain began to hammer on the roof. A sudden, violent drumming. She was overwhelmed by the terror of the day, by the hatred of the town, by the aching, hollow loneliness of the last 2 years, and by this man, this outcast, who had seen her breath shake and refused to let it go. She took the last 2 steps. She put her hands on his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart under her palms. She rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his. It was not a gentle kiss. At first, maybe, it was meant to be. A kiss of gratitude. A thank you for his words, for seeing her. He froze, his body going rigid, his hands at his sides. But she did not pull away. She pressed closer, her eyes squeezing shut. The gratitude was overwhelmed by something else, a desperate, hungry, raw need. The loneliness, the fear, the anger at Jed Stone, the spark she had felt when their hands touched. It all ignited. This was not a kiss of thanks. It was a kiss of defiance. For one shattering heartbeat, he responded. His hand came up and buried itself in her hair, his fingers gripping her scalp. He pulled her hard against him, and his mouth opened against hers. The kiss was not tender. It was fire and desperation, and the raw, wild taste of the storm. Then, as suddenly as it began, he broke it. He shoved her away. He pushed her back so hard she stumbled, catching herself on the stall post. He staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was a mask of self-loathing and shame. "No," he whispered, his voice choked. "To," she breathed, her lips stinging, her body shaking from the contact. "I am poison," he said. He turned and slammed his fist into the post, the wood cracking. "I am what they say, a savage. I do this to you, the woman who saves me." He was disgusted, not with her, but with himself. He was the animal they accused him of being, taking advantage of her kindness, her fear. "You did nothing," she said, her voice trembling as she stepped toward him. "I kissed you." "It is wrong," he said, shaking his head, backing away. "It's the only thing that has felt right all day," she said, her voice raw. He turned his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He was beaten. He walked to the barn door, the rain lashing in, and looked out at the black, violent night. "Don't go," she whispered. He stopped, his hand on the doorframe. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "The storm, it will kill you. They are gone. Just for tonight. Stay. Please don't go." He stood there for a long time, his back to her, a silhouette against the lightning-lit rain. Finally, his body sagged. He slid down the wall, his back against the rough wood, and buried his face in his hands. He did not go. Clara, her legs trembling too hard to stand, sank to the floor on the opposite side of the barn, by the mule's stall. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her whole body humming from the kiss, from the fear. They stayed like that, on opposite sides of the barn, listening to the rain hammer the roof as the storm raged around them. Neither of them slept. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world was washed clean, the air cool and sharp. The ground was a sea of mud. Clara woke first, her neck stiff, her body cold. She looked across the barn. Toa was finally asleep, his body slumped against the wall, his breathing deep and even. Exhaustion had finally taken him. The barn was a ruin. The ranchers had scattered everything. Hay was everywhere, tools were broken, his small pouch of belongings was torn open, its contents spilled in the mud and straw. Clara stood and went to clean up the mess. She began gathering his things, her hands gentle, a smooth, black river stone, a dried sprig of sage, a small piece of flint, and then she saw them, half buried in the wet hay. His arrows. They were in a small, beaded quiver. The ranchers had dumped them out and missed them, or dismissed them as trash. She pulled them out. There were only 3. She knew what a hunting arrow looked like. She had seen them, hardened wood, or sharp stone, or, most often, a metal tip traded or stolen from settlers, fletched with plain turkey feathers. The arrows in her hand were not those. The wooden shafts were painted with intricate, careful symbols, a red circle for the sun, a blue line for the river. The fletching was not from a turkey. It was from an eagle, bright and clean. And the tips, they were not tips. They were blunt, carved pieces of wood, stained, but not with blood, with dye. These were not weapons. They were ceremonial. They were for a ritual, for a prayer. She held them in her hand, the smooth, painted wood cool against her skin. He could not have killed Billy Stone. Not with these. These were the only arrows he had. He was not the killer. A cold, sick feeling washed over her. Betrayal by scouts. He had said, bounty hunters working for the army. The posse was hunting a man who had not killed the boy. They had attacked him. He was running from them. And in the fight, someone else, someone using arrows to frame a Comanche, had killed Jed Stone's son. He was not running from murder. He was running from an ambush. She stood in the quiet, morning-lit barn, holding the arrows, and the truth settled on her, cold and heavy as a burial stone. He was innocent. Clara stood in the cold morning light of the ruined barn, the 3 painted arrows held loosely in her hand. The mud on the floor was already beginning to dry, and the smell of the storm, damp earth and ozone, was giving way to the familiar, sharp scent of old hay and manure. Across the barn, Toa still slept, his body slumped against the wall, finally claimed by an exhaustion so deep it was close to death. He was innocent. The thought was so clear, so sharp. It cut through the fog of her own fear and fatigue. The posse was hunting the wrong man. They were hunting him for a murder he could not have committed. Not with these arrows. These were arrows of prayer. She looked at his sleeping face. The bruises were fading to a sickly yellow, but the lines of pain and pride were etched deep. Betrayal by scouts. Hunted. He had not been running from a murder. He had been running from an ambush. The bounty hunters, the army scouts. They were the ones who had shot him, beaten him, and left him for dead. And in the fight, or perhaps as a deliberate, cruel act to set the posse on him, they had killed Jed Stone's son. She had to know the truth, not just his truth, but the one the soldiers at the fort would tell. If she was going to save him, she needed more than his fragmented words and her own desperate hope. She needed proof. She needed a name. She gently placed the arrows back in his quiver, tucked it deep inside the hay, and covered him with an old horse blanket. He did not stir. She went to the house, ignoring the wreckage of her kitchen, and pulled her oldest, most faded calico dress from the hook. She put on her sunbonnet, pulling it low to shadow her face. From a small tin box hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom, she took $3 silver. It was nearly all the money she had left in the world. She saddled the mule. It was slow, but it was steady, and no one paid mind to a woman on a mule. A woman on a fast horse looked like she was running. She did not go to the root cellar. She did not wake him. She could not bear to see him look at her with that shame again, the shame of being hidden. She simply locked the house, took a deep breath, and started the long, hot 8-mile ride to Fort Tularosa. The fort was a scar on the landscape, a raw clearing of felled trees and packed earth, surrounded by a high timber palisade. It was a place of noise and men, and a kind of brutal, restless energy that always made her skin crawl. The flag hung limp on its high pole, the air already heavy with the promise of more heat. She slid off the mule, tied it to the public hitching rail, and walked through the wide main gate. The sentries, bored and sweating, barely glanced at her. She was just another drab woman, invisible. She knew where to go. Before Silas had died, she had sometimes taken in laundry from the officers, a way to earn a few extra coins. She walked past the barracks, past the sutler's store, and toward the cluster of steaming sheds and clotheslines at the back of the fort. Several other women were already there, their hands red, their backs bent over boiling vats of lye soap and water. They were laundresses, wives of enlisted men, and a few local women like herself. They looked up, their faces blank, and then returned to their work. Clara picked up an empty basket, as if she were waiting to collect an officer's linens. She kept her head down, her ears open. The fort was humming with talk, not just of the heat or the bad food, but of the posse, of Jed Stone's son. "Heard they rode out again this morning," a corporal said, spitting tobacco near her feet. "Good riddance," his companion replied, leaning against a post. Let the ranchers handle their own engine problems. This was not what she needed. This was just gossip. She needed the men who had been there, the scouts, the bounty men. She drifted, basket on her hip, toward the row of small, dirty adobes that housed the Army scouts and interpreters. A group of 4 men, not in uniform, but wearing Army-issued pistol belts, were sitting outside on a bench, passing a bottle. They were loud, their laughter sharp. $50, one of them said. A large, bearded man with a stained buckskin shirt. That's all the captain offered. $50 for the head of a peace talker. Clara's blood went cold. She stopped, pretending to inspect a snag in her skirt. "It ain't the money, Ames," another one said. He was younger, with nervous, darting eyes. "It's the principle. The man was a traitor." "A traitor to who?" said a third, taking a long pull from the bottle. "He betrayed the rebels, that's what. Tried to get his band to lay down. Come into the fort. The army wanted him to do it. But the rebels, they wanted his scalp. And the captain, hell, the captain just wanted the raids to stop, one way or another. So we ride out." The bearded man, Ames, continued. "To talk to this peace broker, and he sees it's a trap. He bolts. Good fight, though. He's a tough one." "Too tough," the nervous one muttered. "He got away. He didn't get far." Ames laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "He's shot up bad. By now, the coyotes have finished him." "And now," the third man said, "Jed Stone's boy is dead, and Stone's posse is blaming our man. Even better, Ames said, slapping his knee. The posse finds him. They hang him for a murder he didn't even do. We save our powder, and the Indian problem solves itself. Who did kill the kid? The nervous one asked, his voice low. Ames shrugged. Who cares? Maybe it was one of the rebels, angry at the boy for being on their land. Maybe it was an accident. He grinned, his teeth brown. Point is, Stone's posse is on the hunt, and our target is the same. A traitor is a traitor, and that Snow Woman's husband. He would have wanted us to finish the job. Clara almost dropped the basket. She could not breathe. She turned, her movement stiff, and walked away. She kept walking, past the laundresses, past the barracks, her steps measured, her spine rigid. She did not run. She walked out the main gate, untied her mule, and mounted it. She did not look back. She rode the 8 miles home in a daze, the world blurred by a red haze of fury and sickness. He betrayed the rebels. It all fell into place. He had tried to make peace. He had spoken to the army. For that, his own people had branded him a traitor. The army, seeing the peace fail, had branded him a traitor too. He was caught between 2 worlds, crushed by both. And that Snow Woman's husband, Silas, her husband. These were the men Silas used to drink with, the men who had filled his head with rumors of strikes. They knew her. They knew who she was. The man who had saved her life was being hunted by men her own husband had called friends. The sickness rose in her throat. She was half a mile from her homestead when she saw the smoke. It was not a campfire. It was a thick, greasy, black column, rising into the pale sky. No, she whispered. She kicked the mule, her heels digging into its ribs, forcing it into a jarring, painful trot. No, no, please, no! She came over the last rise. Her barn was gone. It was a roaring pillar of fire, the roof already collapsed, sending a volcano of sparks into the air. The heat was so intense she could feel it on her face from 100 yards away. The house was untouched, but the barn... She slid off the mule, her legs collapsing under her, and crawled the last few feet. A small group of townsfolk were there, watching from a safe distance. Martha Albright was at the front, her arms crossed, her face a grim mask of satisfaction. "What happened?" Clara screamed, grabbing Martha's arm. "What did you do? Where is he?" Martha shook her off, her expression full of disgust. "He ran. Girl." "That's what happened." What? "The posse. They circled back," Martha said, her voice sharp and loud. "For all to hear. They knew you'd lied. They came back, and he knew he was trapped. He bolted right from your root cellar, made a run for it. They're chasing him now, toward the ridge." Clara stared at the fire, her mind numb. He had run. He had left. "Good riddance," another neighbor muttered. "And good riddance to that barn. It's cleansed now." Clara looked at the faces. They were hard, satisfied, righteous. They were watching her home burn as if it were a holiday. He ran, but he had promised. He had stayed. He wouldn't just run. Not without her. She stumbled away from them, toward the house, toward the cellar door. The one in her kitchen was gone. It was smashed into pieces. The wood splintered. They had not just opened it. They had destroyed it. She knelt by the cellar's stone-lined opening. The crowd was still watching the fire, celebrating the destruction. In the mud, just inside the cellar's shadow, she saw it, a glint of metal, the small paring knife she had given him, and next to it, on the edge of the stone, a dark, wet smear of blood, fresh blood, and beside that, half hidden by a clod of dirt, a 3-foot length of cut rope. Her heart stopped. He had not run. They had lied. The neighbors, Martha, all of them. They had lied. The posse had come back. They had found him in the cellar, just as she had feared. He had tried to fight, the knife, the blood, but there were too many. They had roped him, beaten him, and dragged him out. And then, as a final act of spite, they had torched the barn. They had taken him. A cold, clear rage, sharper and purer than any emotion she had ever felt, settled over her. It burned away the fear, the grief, the numbness. She stood up. She walked, her step steady, past the crowd, past her burning barn. She went to the corral. Silas's old gelding, spooked by the fire, was pacing in the far corner. She grabbed its bridle. She did not bother with a saddle. She grabbed a handful of mane, hauled herself onto its bare back, grabbed the old rifle Silas kept strapped to the corral fence, and kicked the horse into a run. She rode straight past the crowd. Martha Albright's mouth fell open. "Where do you think you're going, girl?" she shrieked. Clara did not answer. She followed the tracks. They were easy to see in the mud from last night's storm. A dozen shod horses, and the marks of a man being dragged. She rode, her body low, her face grim. They were not trying to hide. They were arrogant. They had their prize. They were heading north, toward the ridge. Just as Martha had said, but he was not running. He was their prisoner. The sky, which had been clear, turned. The wind picked up again, cold and sharp. The clouds that had been gathering on the horizon rolled in, a dark purple mass. Rain began to fall. Not a gentle rain, but a hard, driving, ice-cold downpour. The tracks in the mud began to blur, to wash away. Clara panicked, kicking the horse faster. The gelding slipped, its hooves sliding in the slick mud. It went to its knees. Clara was thrown, landing hard on her shoulder, the rifle flying from her grasp. She lay in the freezing mud, the breath knocked from her, the rain lashing her face. For a moment, she wanted to stay there. It was over. She had failed. He was gone. She was cold, so cold. And then she remembered. The blizzard, the memory, which had been a comfort, now returned with a vivid, painful clarity. It was not just him shielding her. It was not just the buffalo hide. She had been fading. The cold was a warm, soft sleep. She was letting go. And he had seen it. He had pulled her from the fire, pulled her against his own body. He was kneeling, holding her, his arms wrapped around her. His hand, rough and warm, had splayed across her chest. Not in desire, not in anger. He was feeling for her heart, for her breath. She remembered the shock of his touch, even through the layers of her frozen clothes. His thumb had moved, a slow, steady circle over her breastbone, as if coaxing a dying ember. And he had whispered. His face was close to hers, his breath warm. He was chanting, his voice a low, rhythmic song in his own language. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the spirits. He was praying. He was willing her to live. He had held her and chanted and rubbed her chest until her breath, which had been a shallow flutter, came back in a ragged, painful gasp. He had not just saved her. He had breathed his own life into her. Clara stood up, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. She grabbed the rifle from the mud. She grabbed the horse's reins and hauled herself back onto its back. "Hold on, Toe," she whispered into the wind. "I am coming." She rode for another hour, the rain turning to sleet. The world was a gray, howling misery. The horse was trembling, its breath coming in white plumes. She was lost. The tracks were gone. She topped a small rise, wiping the icy rain from her eyes, and looked down into a shallow canyon. And she saw them. The posse, they were mounting up, their horses fresh. They were leaving, riding south. She saw Jed Stone's face, and it was calm. His work was done. She watched them go. And then she looked to where they had been. There was a lone, skeletal cottonwood tree by a small, flooding creek, and tied to it, slumped and unmoving, was a man. She waited until the posse was gone. A full 10 minutes, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it would break her ribs. Then she rode. He was tied to the tree, his hands bound behind the trunk with the same rope she had seen at the cellar. He was soaked to the bone, his body pale and shaking with a cold that would kill him. They had beaten him again. His face was a mask of fresh blood, one eye swollen shut, his lips split. They had not killed him. They had left him to die. Left him for the storm, for the wolves. It was a slower, more cruel execution. She slid off the horse, her rifle in her hand. She ran to him, slipping in the mud. "Toa," she said. He did not move. "Toa," she screamed, her voice tearing. She dropped the rifle and fumbled in her pocket for the small paring knife. Her hands were numb, frozen claws. She could not feel the handle. A low groan. His head lifted. Just an inch. He was alive. "Clara," he breathed. The word was a puff of air. "I'm here," she said, sawing at the wet, thick rope. "I'm here. I'm cutting you free." The rope snapped. He fell, a dead weight, into the mud at her feet. He was too weak to stand. "You have to help me," she panted, trying to lift him. He was so heavy. "Toa, you have to try. I cannot do this alone. You have to try." He made a sound, a deep, animal grunt of effort. He got one arm up, tried to push. She dragged him, pulled him, got him to the horse. "Up," she commanded. "Up, now!" It was the hardest thing she had ever done. It was the blizzard. In reverse. She used a rock. She pulled. She got his arm over the horse's back. He gave one desperate, pained shove and fell, belly down, over the gelding. She scrambled up behind him, her wet dress hiking up to her knees. She grabbed his shirt, his belt, and hauled him upright. He slumped back against her, his head lolling, his full, dead weight pressing her against the horse's rump. She wrapped one arm around his chest, grabbing a handful of his torn shirt. She grabbed the reins with the other. "Hold on," she whispered, her face buried in his cold, wet hair. Lightning flashed, a brilliant, terrifying crack, and the thunder was immediate. A cannon shot that made the horse rear. She held on, screaming at the horse, her arm a vice around Toa's chest. She rode hard, back the way she came, the storm at her back. The man who had saved her life held tight against her. "I owe you more than my life," she whispered, the words torn away by the wind. "I owe you your life. Just hold on." They got back to the homestead hours later. It was full dark. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. The barn was a smoking, black skeleton. The embers hissed in the rain. She half dragged, half carried him into the ruin. The fire had died, but the stones of the foundation were still warm. She pulled him into the one corner that still had a partial wall, sheltering them from the wind. She collapsed beside him, her body finally giving out. She was shaking from cold, from terror, from adrenaline. He was so still. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. "No," she said. "No, you don't. You don't get to die. Not now." She pulled him close, dragging his head into her lap. She was sitting in the mud and ashes, her back against the warm stone, cradling him. "Toa," she whispered, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe the blood and rain from his face. "Toa, breathe." "You heard me. Breathe." He was not moving. She was terrified. After all this, he was dying. She bent down, her lips brushing his forehead, his cheek. They were ice cold. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her own tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Don't you leave me alone." She pressed her mouth to his. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not the angry, desperate kiss in the barn. It was a plea, a desperate, hopeless attempt to push her own breath, her own life, back into him. His lips were cold, unresponsive. She pulled back, a sob breaking in her throat. And then he stirred. A low sound came from his chest. His hand, bruised and caked in mud, lifted. It was a slow, agonizingly weak movement, but it was a movement. His fingers found her jaw, her cheek. They were cold, but they were there. He pulled her head back down, and he kissed her back. It was the barest brush of lips, weak, trembling, tasting of blood and rain, but it was him. He was answering. He was alive. The ruin of the barn was a black, smoking skeleton against the dawn. The rain had stopped, leaving the world cold, wet, and smelling of ash and mud. Clara, her body a single, deep ache, half dragged, half carried Toa from the warm stones of the foundation into the house. The kitchen was a nightmare. The posse had left nothing untouched. Flour, beans, and the glass of her shattered preserves crunched under her boots. The table was overturned, the chairs in pieces. It was a violation so complete it left her numb. She settled him near the hearth. It was the only part of the house that felt whole, the only part that still held warmth. The great stone fireplace was the heart of the home, and it was intact. "Stay," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He was too weak to do anything else. He had kissed her back in the mud, a flicker of life, but the exposure, the beatings, and the long, cold night had taken him to the edge. He slumped against the stone, his eyes closed, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. For 2 days, he did not move from that spot. Clara lived in a blur, a fog of adrenaline and grim purpose. She swept the glass and filth from the floor. She found an unbroken pot and boiled water, washing him as he lay there, his body burning with fever. She stitched the worst of the new cuts on his face and hands. She fed him broth, spoonful by spoonful, forcing it past his lips. She did not sleep. She sat on the floor, her back against a broken chair, the rifle across her lap, watching the road. They did not sleep apart. Their world had shrunk to the 4 feet of plank flooring in front of the fire. She made a pallet of the blankets and quilts the posse had slashed, piling them thick. She lay on one side, he on the other, the fire between them. But as the fever gripped him, he shivered, and she moved closer, lending her own small warmth to his. The line between them blurred. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke. His good eye, no longer swollen, was clear. He was lying on the pallet. She was asleep, sitting up against the hearth, her head on her knees, the rifle still balanced across her lap. He watched her for a long time. He saw the exhaustion that had carved new lines into her face. He saw the way her hand, even in sleep, was clenched into a fist. He looked at the ruin of her kitchen, the smashed furniture. He looked at his own hands, clean and bandaged. A shame, deeper than any he had ever felt, washed over him. It was not the shame of weakness, but the shame of his poison. He had brought this destruction to her. He tried to sit up. The movement, a groan of stiff muscles, woke her instantly. She snapped awake. The rifle coming up before her eyes were even fully open. She saw him, watching her, and the tension left her body in a rush. "To," she breathed. "You should not," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He nodded toward the rifle, toward the door. "I should not what?" she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Protect what's mine." He had no answer. Slowly, life began to filter back into the ruined house. He was still weak, his ribs aching, his limp more pronounced, but he was strong. He began to move. He did not speak much, but he acted. While she was outside, digging potatoes from the cellar, he took the pieces of her broken chairs and, with her paring knife, began to patiently strip the wood. Fashioning splints, he righted the heavy table. He took the smashed back door, which the posse had kicked from its hinges, and reset it, bracing it with his new splints. They worked side by side, a man and a woman in a ruined house, rebuilding. The silence was not awkward, as it had been in the barn. It was a shared, comfortable thing. They were 2 people who had seen the worst of the world and had survived. The glances became heavier. When she handed him a cup of coffee, her fingers brushed his. Neither pulled away. When he moved past her in the small space by the fire, his shoulder brushed her arm. It was a solid, warm contact that made her skin tingle. One evening, she was sitting by the fire, brushing her hair. She had washed it in the creek, the first time in weeks, and it hung, heavy and damp, down her back. She had always worn it pulled back in a tight, severe widow's knot, a knot of grief and propriety. Slowly, she pulled the pins out, letting them drop, one by one, onto the stone hearth. The thick, brown waves fell, covering her shoulders. It was a release, a small, private act of defiance. He was across the fire, carving a new handle for a pot, and he stopped. He watched her, his hands still. He watched the firelight catch the red highlights in her hair. She looked up, met his gaze, and did not look away. "Your hair," he said, his voice low. "It is pakwitsu." "What does that mean?" she asked, her hands frozen in her hair. It means the smoke from a fire at sunrise, he said. It is not brown. It is, he gestured with his hand, Pakwitsu. A slow warmth bloomed in her chest. She had been the widow for 2 years. He had just made her a sunrise. He set the wood down. The wind, he said, touching the air. Suna, he touched the fire. Cuts, he placed his hand, very gently, over his own chest, then hers. Samar, Samar, she repeated. Breath, he said. The soul. He had given her his words. Not just any words, but the elemental, private names for the world. Wind, fire, breath. They sat in the flickering light, the air charged with these new sounds, these new meanings. The small space between their palates felt impossibly large, a canyon of unspoken things. That night, she lay awake. She could hear him breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of Samar. She was so aware of him, of his body, just a few feet from hers, that she ached. The loneliness of the past 2 years, the terror of the past weeks, the desperate, raw hunger she had felt in the barn. It was all coiled in her stomach, a tight, painful knot. She did not know when she fell asleep. She just knew she woke up. The fire had burned down to low, pulsing red embers. The room was dark, and he was standing over her. She did not cry out. She looked up at him, a dark, broad-shouldered shape against the red glow of the coals. He was standing, but he was reaching. His hand was outstretched, his fingers parted, not in a threat, but in a question. He was offering, he was asking. He did not speak. He did not have to. Clara looked at his outstretched hand. It was the hand that had held her in the blizzard, the hand that had gripped her jaw when he kissed her back in the mud. She made her choice. She lifted her own hand, small and pale in the darkness, and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. He pulled, gently. She stood up. They faced each other in the darkness, their hands locked, their breath mingling. He did not pull her into a desperate embrace. He just lifted his other hand and touched her face. His thumb, rough with callus, traced the line of her cheekbone, her jaw, the soft, trembling curve of her mouth. It was a touch of wonder, of reverence, as if he were memorizing her in the dark. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, angry kiss of the storm. It was not the cold plea in the mud. It was a kiss of slow, deliberate heat. It was a question and a promise, and she answered. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, her fingers tangling in his long, black hair. It was the end of all things, the end of loneliness, the end of grief, the end of being the widow Winthrop, the years of solitude, the hollow, aching grief for a husband she had not truly loved, the biting terror of the posse, the shame of the town. It all broke. It shattered apart, washed away by a tide of pure, raw, undeniable need. Their bodies met. It was not gentle. It was not sweet. It was a collision. It was raw and intense and desperate. It was two people who had been half dead for years, suddenly, violently, choosing to be alive. Their movements were not graceful. They were hungry, intense, a fight against all the death they had seen. It was the samar of his breath, hot against her neck, the cuts of the fire, the heat of his skin against hers. They fell onto the pallet, a tangle of limbs and blankets, their bodies speaking the words their mouths could not. It was a storm, in the heart of their ruined house. Afterward, they lay in the tangled blankets, their bodies slick with sweat, their limbs heavy. The fire was just embers. The house was completely silent, save for their ragged breathing. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his ribs. She could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. She had never felt so safe. "Clara," he whispered, his hand stroking her loose hair. "I am here," she said. She lifted her head, looking at him in the faint red light. "I want a life with you, Toa," she whispered. The words were a confession, more intimate than the act itself. "I don't care about the town. or the posse, or this house. I want this. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a deep, profound sadness that had not been there before. He had taken her. He had claimed her, and he knew what it would cost her. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "You are Ida Samo, Ida Kukuts. You are the only place I feel warm again." He was her hearth. She was his. It was enough. The next morning, the world returned. They were sitting by the fire, sharing a pot of coffee, their knees brushing. A small, domestic peace. They were shy with each other, their glances new, their touches hesitant. Then came the sound of a horse. Not a posse, one man riding slow. Toe was on his feet, his body tense, his hand reaching for the knife. "In the cellar," Clara said, her voice flat. "No," he said. "No more holes, no more hiding." She grabbed his arm. "Not to hide, to wait. Let me handle this." He looked at her, then gave a sharp nod and slipped behind a partition of blankets she had hung, vanishing from sight. Clara opened the door before he could knock. Sheriff Brody was on his horse, his face grim. He did not look at her. He looked past her, into the house, his gaze sweeping the floor. Looking for what? A second cup? "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold. "Sheriff, what's left to destroy?" Clara's voice was ice. Brody's face flushed. He dismounted. "I'm not here for that. I'm here to deliver a message." "From who? Jed Stone?" "From the law. From the town. Mrs. Winthrop." "Clara, people are talking. Let them." "They're saying things," he said, clearly uncomfortable, but angry. "They're saying you're a disgrace, that you're harboring that savage, that you've forgotten your own husband's memory." "Silas has been dead for 2 years, Clara said, her voice flat. "My memory is my own. Not in this town. It ain't," Brody snapped. "You're a white woman. There are lines. And you've crossed them. Jed Stone is offering $100 for that Comanche's scalp. 100. Men are coming from all over the territory to hunt him. And they're all going to start right here, at your door. Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's a fact," he said, his voice rising. "I've been trying to protect you. I've been telling them you were a frightened widow, but after yesterday, after you rode out of here like a wild thing, no one's buying it. They think you're his—" "Say the word, Sheriff," Clara said, her eyes burning. He looked away, his jaw tight. "You're a fool. Clara, you're throwing your life away." "I have no life. You all made sure of that," she said. "You all stood by and watched me starve. You watched me grieve. You pitied me and then you forgot me. Now I am not your concern." "The hell you ain't!" He turned, and she realized he wasn't alone. He had not come to warn her. He had come to fetch her. A wagon was parked down the road. Jed Stone was on it, and Martha Albright, and a half-dozen others. "The town council is meeting," Brody said, grabbing her arm. "And you're coming. Get your hand off me," she said. "You're coming," he repeated, "or I'm arresting you for harboring a fugitive. A murderer." "He is not a murderer." "Tell it to them," Brody said, dragging her toward the wagon. She did. They did not take her to a town hall. They took her to Henderson's general store. It was the only place large enough. They had convened a citizens' council, which was just a lynch mob in collars. They stood her in the middle of the room. Jed Stone, his face a white mask of hate. Martha Albright, her arms crossed, her eyes full of righteous venom. And a dozen other faces, faces she had known all her life, now twisted with suspicion and anger. "Mrs. Winthrop," said Henderson, the store owner, his voice shaking. "We have a proposition, for your own good." "He's in your house, ain't he?" Jed Stone snarled, stepping forward. "That redskin killer, he's there right now." "He is a man," Clara said, her voice shaking, but loud. "He is an animal," Stone roared. "He put an arrow in my boy." "He did not," Clara said. The room went silent. His arrows are ceremonial. They're made of painted wood. He had no weapons. She's lying, someone shouted. She's his squaw, another voice. A man's, yelled from the back. The room erupted. Disgrace! Shame on Silas's memory. She's as bad as he is. Clara stood there, her head high, and let the hatred wash over her. She was terrified, but she was also free. She waited until they were quiet. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was low, and it cut through the noise like a razor. You all watched me, she said, her gaze moving from face to face. For 2 years, you watched me grieve alone. You watched me try to run this farm alone. When the drought came, not one of you offered to help me dig my well deeper. When my mule went lame, not one of you offered to lend me a horse. You brought pies, and then you forgot. You looked away. She turned her eyes on Martha Albright. You told me to sell my land. You told me I was a foolish woman. She turned to Brody. You told me to lock my doors. I was dying, she said, her voice raw. I was dying, right here, in front of all of Blah, and you did nothing. You just watched. She took a deep breath. That man, the one you call a savage, he held me once, when I was freezing to death in a blizzard. He wrapped me in his own fur and he sat in the snow, and he saved my life. And then, she said, her voice dropping, he saved me a second time. He came here, wounded and dying, and he reminded me what it was to be alive, what it was to fight. She looked at Jed Stone. I am sorry for your boy. Jed, I truly am. But Toa did not kill him. He is not a killer. He is a man, and he is a better man than any of you. The silence in the store was absolute. It was a silence of profound shock. Several faces in the back. Women looked down, their faces flushed with shame. They remembered. They had watched, but Jed Stone's face only hardened. She's confessed, he said. She's with him. Sheriff Brody stepped forward. The shame on his face was warring with his duty. He looked at Clara, and his eyes were cold. Clara Winthrop, you have an ultimatum. You have until sundown tomorrow. You either turn that Comanche over to us, or you ride out with him. If you are on this land, on any land in this county, after sundown tomorrow, we are seizing your property, the farm, the mule, everything. You will lose everything, and we will burn you out. Clara stared at him. This was her home, her land. You can't, she whispered. It's already done. Brody said, the council has voted. Be gone, or he hangs, and you'll be left with nothing but the ashes. He grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the door. Go, and think about what you're losing. For him. She walked home. She did not cry. She was too cold, too empty. When she got to the house, Toa was standing in the doorway. He had heard the wagon return. He had watched. He saw her face. He knew. That night, they did not speak. They ate a silent meal of cold beans. The air in the house was colder than the night outside. She fell asleep, exhausted, on the pallet, her mind a blank wall of terror. She woke in the dead of night. The space beside her was empty. Toa? She scrambled up. The pallet was cold. A cold, sick panic, worse than anything the posse had made her feel, seized her. He was gone. She ran out of the house. Toa! She ran to the corral. The mule was still there. The gelding was still there. And he was there. He was by the corral gate, his back to her. He was not trying to take a horse. He was just standing, ready to walk. You're leaving, she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a death sentence. He did not turn. It is the only way. The only way for what? For you, he said. His voice flat. The land, the house. You stay, I go. He was sacrificing himself. Again. He was going to walk out onto the plains, with $100 bounty on his head, and let the wolves find him, so that she could keep, what, an empty house? A town that hated her? You're saving me, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You're saving me by leaving. I am poison, he whispered. You are a fool, she said, and she slapped him. She hit him, open-palmed, across his face, a crack that echoed in the cold night air. It was a sound of such shocking violence, from her, that it made them both freeze. He turned, his head slowly, his hand raised to his cheek. His eyes were wide, not with anger, with pure, stunned shock. And then she broke. The slap had been the last of her strength. The dam of her control, her anger, her terror, just collapsed. A sob tore out of her, a raw, animal sound. She fell against him, her fists beating weakly on his chest, the chest she had slept on. "Don't you do it," she wept, her words muffled against his shirt. "Don't you dare." "Clara," he said, his arms frozen, hesitant. "You think that's saving me?" she cried, looking up at him, her face a mess of tears and fury. "You think leaving me here alone with them is saving me, after last night? You think I can just go back to being the widow?" She hit his chest again. "That's not saving me. That's just another way of leaving me to die. That's abandonment." She was hysterical, sobbing, her body shaking. I won't be left," she choked out. He looked down at her, at this small, wild, furious woman who was clinging to him. He had seen her cold with fear. He had seen her fierce with anger. Now he was seeing her broken, and he finally understood. His honor, his sacrifice, it was just his own form of running, his own pride. She was not asking him to save her. She was asking him to stay. Slowly, his arms, which had been frozen, wrapped around her. He pulled her tight, his hand burying itself in her hair, holding her head against his chest. He held her, letting her sobs shake both of them, his cheek resting on the top of her head. "I am here," he whispered into her hair. "I am here. Don't save me by leaving," she wept. "That is not saving me." "I will not," he said, his voice a low, final vow. "I will not." He held her in the cold starlight of the corral, her sobs quieting against the steady beat of his heart. She was right. His plan to leave was a form of pride, another way of running, another way of failing her. It was the act of a man who still believed he had honor to save, when all he had left was a life to live, and that life, he now understood, was bound to the small, fierce woman in his arms. "You will not be left," he said, his voice a low vow against her hair. "We go, together." She pulled back, her face streaked with tears and mud, her eyes wide in the dark. "Together? Go where? They'll hunt us." "They will hunt me," he said. "They will hunt what they know. We will not go where they know." He led her back to the house, his arm firmly around her waist, as if he might lose her if he let go. Inside the ruined kitchen, he sat her by the hearth and rebuilt the fire, laying new wood on the embers. The cuts, the flame caught, casting their shadows long and dancing on the walls. "There is a place," he said, staring into the new fire. "North, past the high plains, past the San Juan. It is deep hidden. A canyon walled in red stone. My grandfather's people lived there. Before." "Your kin?" Clara asked, her voice a whisper. "They are there?" "Some," he said, his face hardening. "The ones who did not walk the white man's road, the ones who did not bend. It is a hard country. The winter is deep, but it is safe. No soldiers go there, no ranchers. The land, it protects." Clara looked around the room, at the smashed plates, the splintered chair, the floor stained with flour and her own lost hopes. She looked at the door. The door Sheriff Brody had threatened to burn. "We will lose everything," she said, but her voice was not sad. It was a flat statement of fact. "We have nothing," Toa replied, looking at her. "Here." "No," she said, a small, slow smile touching her lips. She reached out and touched his hand. "We have this." The ultimatum was sundown the next day. They had less than 24 hours. The plan was simple, brutal in its finality. They would take the gelding, Silas's horse, and the mule. They would pack only what the animals could carry: food, water, and warmth. Everything else would be left to the town. to the ashes. Clara moved with a new, grim purpose. She was no longer a victim, waiting for the next blow. She was a woman preparing for a journey. She gathered what was left of her supplies: a full sack of flour, a bag of salt, all the dried beans. She took the tin of coffee. She packed a side of bacon, her iron skillet, her sharpest knife, and her sewing needles. She found Silas's box of ammunition for the rifle. She put all of it into 2 canvas sacks. She went to her bedroom. The mattress was slashed, the feathers drifting like snow. She ignored it. She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed. It was smashed, the lid broken. But inside, beneath the ruined linens, was the buffalo hide. She pulled it out. It was heavy, the fur thick and soft, the hide worn but supple. It still smelled faintly of smoke and sage. She had kept it hidden for 5 years. She brought it into the kitchen. Toa, who was mending a bridle with strips of wet leather, looked up, his eyes fixed on the hide, and his face softened. He reached out and touched it. A long, slow caress. "You kept this," he said. "It was the only thing that kept me warm." She said. She folded it carefully. It would be their bed, their shelter. She found her mother's red woolen shawl, the only beautiful thing she owned. She tore a long, clean strip from the edge. She left everything else. She left the broken mirror, the portrait of her parents, the wedding ring she had stopped wearing 2 years ago, which sat in a small wooden box by the bed. She left the ghost of Silas Winthrop and the ghost of the woman she had been. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same bloody colors as the night of the posse, their work was done. The animals were fed. The packs were by the door. They had only the night to wait. "They will come at dawn," Clara said. She was standing by the window, watching the light fade, watching for the first riders. "They will," Toa said. "I am afraid," she whispered. He came and stood behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth of his body. "To be afraid," he said, "is to be alive. The Samar, the breath, it shakes." She leaned back, her head resting against his chest. "Yes, it shakes." That night, they ate by the fire. They sat on the buffalo hide, their backs against the stone hearth. The house was empty, stripped bare, waiting for the end. "Tomorrow," Clara said, her voice quiet. "We will be—" "What? In that canyon? What will we be?" Toa looked at her. He saw the strength in her face, the lines of fear and determination. He saw the woman who had slapped him, the woman who had held him, the woman who had kissed him back to life. "You will be my woman," he said, the words simple, final, "and I will be your man." "We have no paper," she said. "No preacher." "We have cuts," he said, nodding to the fire. "We have Suna." He gestured to the wind whistling in the chimney. "And we have Samar." He placed his hand on her heart. He reached for the splintered piece of wood he had been carving, the piece from her broken chair. He had been working on it for hours, his knife moving with a slow, patient grace. It was a ring, not round, but carved with a flat front, etched with a small, sharp line, a mountain. He took her left hand. It was rough, chapped, the hand of a farm woman. He slid the wooden ring onto her third finger. It fit perfectly. "My home," he said, touching the ring. "I give you my home." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She took the red strip of cloth she had torn from her mother's shawl. "And I give you my blood, my past." She reached up and tied the red cloth in his long, black hair. It was a startling, bright flash of color against the dark strands. A brand, a promise. "We are married," she whispered. He leaned in, and his kiss was not the desperate hunger of before. It was a vow. It was a seal. It was peace. They lay down on the buffalo hide, in front of the dying fire, and for the first time, they did not just sleep, they rested. Dawn came, cold and gray. They were ready. They loaded the mule, saddled the gelding. Toe checked the rifle, his movements economical and sure. He handed it to Clara. "You ride," he said. "The mule, I will lead." "No, we ride together," she said. He was about to argue when he froze, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the road. "They are here," he said. Clara heard it, too, the slow, deliberate clop of horses. Not a charge, a gathering. They walked to the front of the house. A line of men sat on their horses, blocking the path. There were 10 of them. At the front was Sheriff Brody, his face a grim, tired mask. Beside him was Mr. Henderson, and a half-dozen other ranchers and townsmen. They all held rifles. They had come to enforce the ultimatum. "It's sundown! Clara!" Brody called, his voice heavy. "The time is up!" Toa stepped forward, moving in front of Clara. He stood, his hands open and at his sides. He was unarmed. He was a target. "Toa, no!" Clara whispered, grabbing his arm. "It is done," he said, his voice low. "You stand back." "No," Clara said. She pushed past him. She stepped out from his shadow, her head high, her gaze sweeping the line of men. She was no longer the frightened widow. She was not the hysterical woman who had faced them in the store. She was Clara, Toa's wife, and her eyes were burning. "You're early, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold morning air. "Don't make this harder, Clara," Brody said, his rifle resting on his saddle horn. "Give him up, or ride out. That was the choice." "She is not going," a voice snarled. It was Jed Stone. He rode through the line of men, his face a ruin of sleeplessness and hate. He had a rope in his hand. "And he is not riding out. He was here to see it end." "He killed my boy," Stone said, his voice a raw whisper. "He did not," Clara said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. She stepped forward again, walking right up to Stone's horse. The animal shied, but Clara did not flinch. "You want him?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You will have to shoot me first." "Clara, get back," Brody commanded. "No," she said. She turned, facing them all. She saw their faces, hard, angry, righteous. You all think you are here for justice," she said, her voice ringing. "You think you are here to avenge a boy's death. You are not. You are here because you are afraid. You are here because you are cowards." A murmur of anger went through the men. "You are cowards," she repeated, "because you stood by and you watched me starve. You watched me grieve. And when this man, this one man, showed me a kindness, you tore my house apart. You burned my barn. You called me a whore," she pointed at Jed Stone. "And you want justice, but you are the most blind. You do not want the man who killed your son. You just want a man. You want a scalp. You want an arrow. Any arrow." "Shut your mouth, woman," one of the ranchers growled, lifting his rifle. "No," Clara said. "I will not." She turned, and she told the story. She told it not as a confession, but as a judgment. "5 years ago," she said, her voice clear, "I was caught in the blizzard up on the high mesa. My husband, Silas, he was with me. We were dying." She looked at the men, one by one, meeting their gaze. "We were freezing to death, and this man—" She put her hand on Toa's chest. "He found us. He had one horse. He had one fur. He could have ridden by. He could have taken our guns and our money. He could have left us to die. It is what you would have done." "That's a lie," Henderson shouted. "Is it?" Clara fired back. "You have left me to die for 2 years. Mr. Henderson, with your high prices and your pitying looks." She turned back to the story. "He did not leave us. He put me on his horse. He carried my husband. He took us to shelter. And when I was shaking, when my breath was stopping, he took his only fur, his buffalo hide, and he wrapped me in it. He sat all night, with his back to the wind. He sat in the freezing snow, so that I could be warm." She was crying now, but not from fear, from a rage so pure it was a fire. "He saved my life, and he saved Silas's life, and in the morning, he was gone. He asked for nothing. He took nothing. That is the man you are here to kill. That is the animal who put an arrow in your son." She looked at Jed Stone. "He did not kill Billy. He was hunted, shot, and left for dead by bounty hunters. He had no weapons to kill your son, only painted prayer arrows. I saw them. I held them. The silence was absolute. The men stared at her. They had come to hang a savage. They were being faced by a woman they had known all their lives, who was calling them sinners. Jed Stone's face was white. She's lying. She's his squaw. He's poisoned her mind. Has he? Clara said. She looked at Sheriff Brody. Sheriff, you knew Silas. You drank with him. You know the men he rode with. Ames, the bounty hunter. Ask him who killed Billy Stone. Brody's face changed. He knew. Clara saw it. He knew. He had heard the same talk at the fort. She's right, Jed, Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly admission. Jed Stone stared at him, his mouth open. What? I heard talk, Brody said, looking down at his saddle horn. At the fort, it wasn't him, it was the scouts. They did it. To set the posse on him. It was a mistake. The entire line of men wavered. Their righteous fury, the thing that had held them together, just evaporated. It was all a lie. They were here to kill an innocent man. One of the ranchers, a younger man, lowered his rifle. He looked at Clara, his face flushed with a deep, profound shame. He turned his horse, and he rode away. Another man spat into the dust. This is filth, he muttered. He, too, turned and left. Wait, Jed Stone cried, his voice breaking. He's an Indian. But it was over. The mob had broken. Henderson looked at Clara, his face pale. Ma'am. Go, Clara said, her voice dead. Just go. Brody looked at her, his eyes full of a new, grudging respect. Clara, your land. I can't. It is not my land, Clara said. It is just dirt. Brody nodded. He tipped his hat, a gesture of surrender. He turned, and he led the rest of the ashamed, silent men back to town. Only Jed Stone remained. He sat on his horse, his face crumpled. A man whose entire world had been built on a pillar of hate that had just crumbled to dust. He was not a grieving father. He was just a fool. He looked at Toa, at the red cloth in his hair. He looked at Clara, at the wooden ring on her finger. He said nothing. He just turned his horse, his back slumped, and rode away. Clara and Toa stood alone in the cold morning, the silence of the plains rushing in. Clara turned and leaned her forehead against Toa's chest. She was shaking. The strength, the rage had left her, and she was just tired. He wrapped his arms around her. It is done, Samar, he whispered. It is done. They did not wait. They mounted up, Clara on the gelding, the rifle in a scabbard at her knee, the buffalo hide tied behind her, Toe on the mule, leading the way. They rode north. They did not look back at the ruined barn. They did not look back at the empty house, with its broken furniture and its ghosts. They left the town of San Miguel, a town that had never truly been their home, and rode out into the high, hard, unforgiving country. The journey took months. They moved slow, hunted by the weather, not by men. They crossed the high plains, forded the icy San Juan, and moved into the mountain country. Toa knew the way, not by maps, but by the stars, by the shape of the rocks, by the memory in his blood. He taught her how to hunt, how to set a snare, how to find water. She taught him how to read, writing words in the dust, how to bake bread in the hot ashes of a fire. They found the canyon. It was as he had said, a deep, hidden valley, walled by sheer cliffs of red stone. A small, clear river ran through it. It was a world hidden from the world. His kin were there, a small, lost band of fewer than 20 people. They were old, and they were scarred. They looked at Toa with suspicion, the traitor who had returned, and they looked at Clara with fear. But Clara was not the snow woman. She was Toa's wife. She worked. She hauled water. She cured hides. She learned their words. She showed them the ring on her finger. And Toa did not talk of peace. He just lived. He hunted. He built. He built their home. It was not a farmhouse. It was a small, strong house of stone and river clay, built against the red cliff wall, near a stand of juniper. The seasons turned, The wildflowers bloomed, a carpet of blue and yellow. The deer wandered close to their door, their eyes dark and curious. Clara was pregnant. One evening, the first snow of the season began to fall. It was not a blizzard. It was a gentle, quiet white, dusting the red rocks. Clara stood in the doorway of their new home, her hand on her swollen belly, watching the snow. The buffalo hide hung on the wall inside, a map of their past. Toa came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands joining hers on the curve of their child. They watched the snow fall together. "You carried me through the storm twice now," she whispered, leaning her head back against his chest. He held her tighter, his lips brushing her hair. The red cloth now faded to a soft rose. "This time," he answered, his voice a low, warm rumble. "I'll never let go. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly hope it brought a piece of the Old West to you. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please, leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this, I hope you'll consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. What did you feel? What did you think of Clara and Toa? Your words mean the world to me.